Vai começar. Ora vê agora.
Agora, olha de novo.
Oi. Tá? Então, bom dia a todos. Como todos sabem, p-valores ou p-values têm sido usados por pesquisadores em áreas científicas com o objetivo principal de concluir que alguma associação é estatisticamente significante. Usualmente, o pessoal usa 0,05 ou 5%, e isso é um número bastante arbitrário. Em muitos desses estudos científicos, em várias áreas do conhecimento, a interpretação do p-valor é feita de forma não muito correta. Isso tem acontecido por décadas. Em 2016, a American Statistical Association, na pessoa do seu diretor executivo, o professor Ronald Wasserstein, escreveu um artigo intitulado The ASA Statement on P-Values, Context, Process and Purpose. E foi publicado no jornal The American Statistician e teve mais de 150 mil visualizações. Entretanto, muita discussão tem sido feita sobre esse tema em várias áreas do conhecimento. E no passado dia 20 de março, há 2 dias atrás, saiu um artigo na Nature, um artigo de opinião, que foi assinado por mais de 800 cientistas, provenientes de mais de 50 países. E ele é intitulado Statistics Rise Up Against Statistical Significance. No dia 16 de março, também na passada semana, foi publicado um número especial do jornal The American Statistician, foi organizado pela American Statistical Association, foi intitulado Statistical Inference in the 21st Century, a world beyond P less than 0.05. Esse número especial incluiu 43 artigos inovadores, sendo o editorial escrito pelo diretor executivo da American Statistical Association e por 2 colegas. Desta forma, estamos no melhor momento possível para discutir um pouco mais sobre este tema dos p-valores e sobre a prática de uso dessas estatísticas. E quem poderia ser melhor para falar sobre isso que não o próprio diretor executivo da Associação Americana de Estatística, o professor Ronald Wasserstein. Temos assim o prazer de ter connosco online o professor Ronald Wasserstein, que irá ministrar o Seminário Inaugural de 2019 do ciclo de palestras do Departamento de Estatística da UFBA, que em 2019 será denominado de Seminários em Estatística e Ciência de Dados. Ron, ele é o diretor executivo da American Statistical Association desde 2007, é o porta-voz oficial da American Statistical Association e, na minha opinião, um dos maiores líderes e representantes da estatística, quer na América do Norte, quer em termos mundiais. Eu conheci o Ron num congresso na Eslovénia, em 2010, e desde então temos mantido bastante contacto. Ele é uma pessoa realmente muito extraordinária, quer pessoalmente, quer profissionalmente. Eu acho que é daquelas pessoas que faz o mundo um lugar melhor. É mesmo a opinião pessoal minha. Então, é um prazer e uma honra poder apresentar o professor Ronald Wasserstein, que irá apresentar a palestra intitulada Doctor, It Hurts When I Pee. Ron, I have just gave a short introduction of yourself, and now I can give you the floor. Let me just remove. Okay, Ron, if you can hear me, please go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you very much. I apologize to all of you that this presentation is in English. If you have trouble understanding me, that's okay. I assure you that your English is better than my Portuguese. I want to thank my very good friend, Paulo, for having me this morning. Paulo and I met a few years ago in Portugal, and I am grateful to him for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Let me say a few words about p-values and the null hypothesis significance testing procedure. Some of you may be very familiar with this already, and maybe a few of you less so. So we want to learn something. We're scientists. We want to learn something, and we know something already. What do we already know about something? And then what do we want to know next? What else do we want to know? And so we design an experiment to try to figure out what is the next thing we want to know. And then from that experiment, we collect some data. And then we use statistics to summarize that data in some way. And now we want to figure out what we know now based on that. So when we summarize that data, we compute something that we call a statistic. Depending on the nature of the data, that statistic may be various things, may be simple, may be fairly complex. And then we compute a probability. That probability is called a p-value. And if that p-value is small, if it's a small enough number, then we call that result statistically significant. Now, what's the logic behind statistically significant? First of all, to compute that number, we had to assume some things. And then we calculated the probability of observing the data that we did, and maybe some more extreme number than we did. And then if the probability that we calculated is a small number, then one of two things has to be true. One of the things that we assumed is wrong, or we had bad luck. Now, the very famous statistician, R.A. Fisher, called such results significant. And looking back on that now, that was a mistake. Significant to R.A. Fisher meant that the result that we have found was worth further scrutiny. It was worth looking at more closely. That we should just investigate it further. But unfortunately, in English, the word significant has a heavier meaning than that. In English, significant is kind of a weighty word. Let's think about in English the opposites of the word significant. Insignificant, that's not good. Unimportant, meaningless. Or if we think about ways that we use the word significant, for example, a significant increase. If we want we want a significant increase in our salary, for example, a significant event in our lives, a wedding, the birth of a child. I don't know if you say this in Brazil, but here we talk about a girlfriend or a wife or whatever as a significant other. Words can have more than one meaning. For example, the word mole in English. The word mole can refer to this little creature that digs up around in the ground, or a mole is a spy, someone hidden in an organization that's feeding secrets to another organization. Or if you're a chemist, a mole is a very specific concept. It's a measure. Now, if I'm using the word mole in a sentence, it's never going to get mixed up between one of those three things. But lots of words that are in science do get misused. For example, let's take the word theory. In science, a theory is a very specific thing. A scientific theory is an explanation of some aspect of the natural world that's been substantiated through a series of repeated experiments or testing. For example, the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is something that's come about through repeated experiments, through repeated observations, and so on. But we use the word theory in common language all the time, and we can just brush that off when we're in a common conversation. Well, what's your theory about why he hasn't been coming to work lately? A theory is just an idea that lives in somebody's head rather than an explanation that's rooted in an experiment or testing. Similarly, the word hypothesis. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for something, but the key part of the definition of the word hypothesis is something that can be tested. If you have a hypothesis, what makes it a hypothesis is that it is something that can actually be provable, that you can test it. If you can't test it, it's not a hypothesis. But as the word is commonly used, it's just an educated guess. Now, here's another example. The word natural. The things that are natural are things that occur in nature. But in common usage, that word has become synonymous with things that are virtuous, that are healthy and good. I don't know if this is true where you are, but here in the U.S., natural foods, natural things are considered sort of like to be better, and things that are unnatural or artificial are sort of automatically bad. Now, I didn't pick these words at random. This is from an article in Scientific American, Just a Theory, 7 misused scientific words. Word number 6 in the 7 misused scientific words is the word significant. Significant is a commonly misused scientific word, and it's misused very badly when it comes to statistically significant. Now, Paulo, I don't know if you're in a position to respond to me or not, but I just wondered if Tinder is used down in Brazil. Tinder is,
yes,
okay. Tinder, as you probably all know, is a dating app, and so the example I would like to use for you is that what p-values, as R.A. Fisher meant to use them, p-values are sort of supposed to be like a right swipe in Tinder. They're supposed to be something that is sort of supposed to be something that's of interest. Okay, so here's a p-value in Tinder that's of interest. It's a small p-value, 0.025. Okay, so this means it's an interesting p-value. You swipe right. My experimental results are interesting. Maybe I should spend more time with them. Maybe I should repeat the experiment. Maybe I'm onto something, but it'll take more time to be sure. That's a right swipe in Tinder. This is not a right swipe in Tinder. Oh, you tiny, beautiful p-value. You're the result that I want to spend the rest of my life with. Let's publish and get grants together. I love you, little p-value. That would be, a right swipe in Tinder is not time to plan a wedding. But that's what's unfortunately happened with the misunderstandings of p-values, is that they've taken on more significance than they were ever meant to. And so things like this started to happen, and this is why we wrote the ASA statement on p-values and statistical significance. In this first headline, odds are it's wrong, science fails to face the shortcomings of statistics. It's not the shortcomings of statistics, it's the shortcomings of people's understandings of p-values. And these the shortcomings of p-values led to a journal banning the use of p-values altogether. And so, as Paulo said, this led the ASA to write the statement on p-values, which has, as of just a few days ago, been downloaded over 296,000 times and already cited in 3 years over 1,700 times in journals. That's 11 citations a week. Now, we're statisticians, so we need something to compare that with. Is that a lot of citations? Is that a lot of downloads? Well, it's not a lot compared to Taylor Swift's 2.6 billion Shake It Off videos, or to John Oliver's 13.3 million views of his show on scientific reproducibility, but it's a lot of views for an article in statistics. It's one of the most viewed scientific articles. It's certainly one of the most viewed statistical articles, which means that there are a lot of people who are interested in what's going on with p-values. So let me just say a few words about the ASA statement on p-values. It articulates 6 principles about p-values, and I'm just going to focus briefly in this talk on 3 of them. Scientific conclusions and business or policy decisions should not be based only on whether a p-value passes a specific threshold. Proper inference requires full reporting and transparency, and by itself, a p-value does not provide a good measure of evidence regarding a model or hypothesis. Now, the big thing that we would want you to take away from the ASA statement on p-values is that bright line thinking is bad for science. That is, in particular, that thinking about p-values and setting a particular cutoff for what a small p-value is has been a very bad thing for science. And in particular, here's one quote from one of the articles that was related, that was contained in the supplements to the p-value statement. Scientists have embraced and even avidly pursued meaningless differences solely because they are statistically significant, and have ignored important effects because they have failed to pass the screen of statistical significance. It is a safe bet that people have suffered or died because scientists and editors, regulators, journalists, and others have used significance tests to interpret results and have consequently failed to identify the most beneficial courses of action. That's a statement by Ken Rothman, who has been among the many who have written and complained about this topic for many, many years. Now, if you're following me on this, and again, I apologize if my English is going by way too fast for you. What I want to show you on these next few slides are things that people have actually written in journal articles, published journal articles, as they've tried to explain the p-values that they have published in the journal articles. Now, what I need to explain here is that over the years, a p-value of 0.05 has come to be for sort of historical, accidental reasons. 0.05 has become this kind of magical threshold. If your p-value of 0.05, if your p-value is smaller than 0.05, this is a good thing. And if not, well, then you've got some talking to do. And so here are examples of people trying to explain they're a little bit bigger than p-value, a little bit bigger than 0.05. And so here are the contortions that they try to do. These are just a few examples. Almost significant, almost attained to significance, almost significant tendency. We'll talk more about this word tendency in a moment. Almost became significant, as though this number is trying to become something. Almost but not quite significant. Almost statistically significant. Almost reached statistical significance. Just barely below the level of significance, and just beyond significance. Now, if your number is a little bigger than that, say 0.08, you've got some more explaining to do. A certain trend toward significance, a definite trend, a slight tendency toward significance, a strong trend toward significance. Let me pause here. All you people in this room, I don't know how many of you there are because neither one of us can see each other at the moment, but let me ask you for a moment to ask yourself, how many numbers does it take for you to determine that there's a trend? Now, you can decide that for yourself. How many numbers does it take to establish a trend? Now, I don't know how many numbers you think it takes to establish a trend, but I'm going to guess that for every one of you in that room, the number that it takes to establish a trend is greater than 1. And that's how many numbers a p-value is. It's one number. And yet every one of these people is trying to establish a trend with one number. And these are not silly people, foolish people, stupid people, but the process of setting an arbitrary threshold has made people sort of twist themselves into trying to establish something that they shouldn't even have to be if there wasn't this arbitrary threshold to begin with. Here's a trend again. A trend approached our criteria as though that criteria was meaning something, and so on. And here's where you really have a problem, friends. If your p-value was close to, but not quite 0.05, hovered, hovers, just about, just above. And here's the one that drives me crazy because they have more significant digits than they should have used. Just barely, just borderline, just escaped, just failed. Oh my gosh, that's unfortunate. And here's the source for those quotes. And if people are interested, Paulo, I'll be happy to share these slides. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. We only wish to emphasize that dichotomous significance testing has no ontological basis. Ontological is a big word that means it just has no reason for being, no reason for existence. That is, we want to underscore that surely God loves the 0.06 p-value nearly as much as the 0.05. That is, can there be any doubt that God views the strength of evidence for or against the null hypothesis as being a fairly continuous function of the magnitude of p? Dichotomous evidence, that is, thinking about P being on one side of 0.05 and P being on the other side of 0.05 as being somehow different leads to strange behaviors. So one suggestion that came into thinking about a year and a half ago from this long set of authors, many of them very well known, was to redefine statistical significance by dropping the threshold a whole order of magnitude, dropping it from 0.05 to 0.005, arguing that it would improve the problem of non-reproducibility by increasing, making the standard of statistical evidence much higher. And they would, but by basically lowering the rate of false positives. And so they proposed a change from P less than 0.05, as I said, to P less than 0.005. And they said that it would immediately improve reproducibility of scientific research in many fields. So a response came from a list of authors, and you see Lakins, Adolphi, ... and Swan. And if you were to click on the ... you would see another long list of authors, and they dispute this point. And they say that they don't think that, that this is a good idea, that they think that it's just as arbitrary to switch from 0.05 to 0.005. And they're opposed to that. They think it will have some positive consequences. They think it will have some negative consequences. And they don't think we've thought through those negative consequences well enough yet. They propose instead that authors more carefully specify their reasons for justifying for their design choices, and that they specify their own cutoffs, and they do so before they collect their data, so that they don't get to decide what their threshold was before they collected their data, and not just use simple choices beforehand. And they argue very much something that I think most people would agree with, is that there's never enough evidence in just one study to make a theory. Now, I'm talking to Brazilians. I assume there are a few of you in the room that care about soccer. And when I think about changing the rules about p-values from 0.05 to 0.005, let me ask you to look at this picture and you tell me whether offside happened here in this picture. Can you tell from this camera angle whether there's a player offside here? Do you think the side referee is going to be able to bring up that flag and make an offside? And then furthermore, let me ask you whether the offside rule, which is already hard enough to call, whether changing the offside rule somehow is going to make it easier or harder to call offside. Well, I just don't think that changing the already difficult offside rule is going to make it any easier to decide whether players are offside or not. Let's just play soccer. All right, so that's part of the issue with p-values, but another issue with p-values is they don't really tell us what we want to know. Let me illustrate that very quickly because I know that you only have a certain amount of time in this seminar. Let's suppose that what we really want to know, let's not suppose, what we really want to know, for example, is let's suppose that there's a blood pressure medication that's been used for a long time, and it's been particularly effective in lowering blood pressure in certain populations. And now there's a new medication that we think will be even more effective. And what we want to know is how likely is it that the new medication is more effective than the old medication? And so we test it. And what we would like to know is the probability that the new medication is more effective than the old medication. So we test it, and we get a p-value of 0.03, and you'd like to think that p-value is giving you the probability, some probability about the new medication being more effective than the old medication, but it's not giving you that at all. That is to say that what we want is the probability that of our hypothesis being true, given the data that we have. But p-values are actually giving us the probability that we have observed the data that we have, given some hypothesis that we have. And even though those two things sound kind of alike, they're not. And here is a 40-year-old example, or a 40-year-old illustration that shows you how those two things are not the same. What's the probability of obtaining a dead person, given that the person was hanged? That is, in symbol form, what's the probability of D given H? So we're here are just made up numbers, okay? Obviously, it will be very high, perhaps 0.97 or higher. That is to say, you know, most people who are you know, if you you know, most people are if you're hanged, you probably die. But if we reverse it, if what's the probability that a person's dead? What's the probability they were hanged? Well, there's a lot of ways that you can die that aren't the result of hanging. So you know, you might have died from any number of things. And so flipping that around, it could be, you know, it could be very low. And so the two things are just not the same. And so you're not gonna make the mistake of flipping those two things around. That is to say, the probability that I was hanged, given that I'm dead, isn't anything like the probability that because I'm dead I was hanged. So I'm not going to make that mistake, but that mistake gets made all the time when I try to flip those two things around. Now I want to go back to something really, really important that I said at the beginning, but I didn't spend very much time on. I said that that when we compute the p-value, we have to assume a whole bunch of things, and we assume that the null hypothesis is true, but we also assume a whole bunch of other things in order to compute the p-value, but once we actually compute the p-value, everybody just jumps to, oh, the null hypothesis must be false, and we never ever see scientists thinking about all the other assumptions that could also be false as well. And that's why Fisher wanted people just to think about the result as being interesting and go back and look more closely, as opposed to jumping ahead and being in too big of a hurry to jump to a conclusion. Inference is hard work, and it's too easy to skip past all the hard work just because you got a low p-value. So the ASA has been asking, how would you conduct research in a world where that p less than 0.05 business had no meaning? We never had that arbitrary cutoff in the first place. It just never happened. In a world where P less than 0.05 carried no meaning, how would you get your paper published, your research grant funded, your drug approved, your policy or business recommendation accepted? So how do we go from the p-value statement where we told people what not to do to move forward to getting to a point where we know what to do? So the first thing we did was a year later, we assembled people here in the Washington, D.C. area, and we asked them those very questions. We had what we called the Symposium on Statistical Inference, and we got people, experts together and asked them to think about what a world beyond P less than 0.05 would look like. Then we opened up this discussion to everyone. We asked people to submit papers to a special issue of the American Statistician called Statistical Inference in the 21st Century, a World Beyond P less than 0.05. That's what Paulo was talking about in the introduction today. This special issue is online only and freely open to everyone. You can go to the American Statistician website, but please wait just a few more minutes to do that until my talk is over, which will be very soon. We received nearly 100 papers. After many rounds of review, we published 43 of those papers. That happened just yesterday. In addition, an editorial summary written by the co-editors, myself and two others, provides navigation through that issue. So what did we say? Very briefly, I'm gonna tell you what's in there. We said to abandon statistical significance. That is, to stop with this business of P less than 0.05, excuse me, P greater than 0.05. Stop calling things statistically significant or not. Stop using confidence intervals as a way to do the same thing. We used a little acronym, ATOM, to tell people what to do instead, to accept uncertainty, to be thoughtful, open, and modest in talking about our results. Accepting uncertainty means to understand that our results are always uncertain, that uncertainty is always there, and to know that drives us to design our experiments thoughtfully, to measure things more closely, and to sample more carefully, and to sample more as our resources allow. Just to give you a little flavor for this, being thoughtful, not that people aren't thoughtful, but to put more energy into the front end, to our data production that's carefully planned, designed, and executed, to imagine a world in which our research will be accepted or rejected based entirely on the research design and methodology. That is to say, that the research will be accepted for publication regardless of what our results are, based on how carefully we did the research in advance and planned the experiment, not on what the results how the results came out. Not just to look at the p-value from the null hypothesis, but also at pre-specified alternatives, such as the minimum meaningful effect size, and for that matter, to think about what that is ahead of time, to vary modeling assumptions, so and look to see whether our results hold up under various assumptions, to think indeed about what prospective outcomes would look like before we conduct the experiment. One quote that I love from the special issue, that thoughtful research considers related prior evidence, the plausibility of the mechanism, so that you don't just go, hey, look at that, and not think about how that could have happened. Study design, data quality, real world costs and benefits, novelty of the finding, and other factors that vary by research domain, without giving priority to p-values or Bayes factors or other purely statistical measures. one of the papers, or several of the papers actually, talk about transforming the p-value into s equal minus log 2 of the p-value, which turns it into something called the Shannon information factor that is a non-0 to 1 measure, a non-probability measure that has interesting properties. And these are other things that are mentioned here. But what I want to say about all these factors here are that that these are at the end after you've done all the careful thinking. And this last one here, I want to definitely mention to look at this paper, because these are authors that are in Brazil. And as for all the rest, my time is up, and now you can go to the internet and look at all of them. And I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of your seminar series today.
Ron, thank you very much. It was, as always, a great pleasure to listen to you and to listen about this hot topic at the moment, p-values. So I will open now the floor for discussion and for questions. I ask the people here to think if they have any question, and meanwhile, we have a couple of questions online.
Cool.
Yes. So the first of them, it says, how does the decrease in the significance value to 0.005 could be related with the huge sample problems as big data problems?
Oh, sure. So right, because if I'm understanding the question right, you can make your p-values, you can make them vanishingly small by having large data sets. So that's exactly right. That the p-value can become as small as you want to make it by having large data sets. So that makes the p-value in that respect not a very good tool. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And there is another one here. The question is from Marcelo. It says, yes, do you think that clinical studies should focus more on functional form of models instead of categorizing? If so, what's the ideal way to present clear results?
So I would say that the ideal way, in my mind, would be to present to look at multiple analyses, so that multiple analyses should lead to the same conclusions. If you have clear results, then multiple analyses should all be pointing in generally the same direction.
Yes. Is there any question here? You can ask in Portuguese and I can translate.
Eu ia fazer nesse português, nessa passada para ele. Ele falou em relação à parte de artigos e tal. Mas como a gente, da área de estatística, entender para quem não é da área de estatística, não entender do mercado, a ideia é que você não vai mais fazer análise de valor, você vai utilizar análise de sentido e outras coisas.
Yes. So one of the questions here from one of the students was basically, how do you sell in the market in terms of consultancy, but I think it can also be related with research. How do you sell the idea that, okay, we are not using the standard p-values anymore, or we are not interpreting that in that way of statistically significant or non-significantly? The question is how to convince people that you should change the way of thinking.
Right. So the first thing to do, I would think, would be to point them to the published research from the American Statistical Association, and beyond that, the in this research, as students have time to read it, and by the way, this editorial is written very non-technically, so it will not be hard to read. The p-value has been used as an excuse for objectivity. It's like, we use this because it's objective. We make p less than 0.05 or p greater than 0.05. That's objective. But behind it has become all these ways of manipulating things so that you can get it just over the line and so on. And that's where the objectivity goes out the window. What has to replace the p-value is better argumentation, more transparency. Be more clear about what your science is, what the rationale behind your presentation is, so everyone can see what you did and why you did it. And since I'm talking to data scientists and potential data scientists, what I want to advocate for to a whole bunch of people who are smarter than me is not to rely on your algorithms without understanding what they do. It's just as easy for algorithms to turn into black boxes and not to understand what the biases in those algorithms might be that you're not aware of. So just again to return back to the students, very good question. Gotta make clear that instead of what p-values we're giving you, make clear what it is that your evidence is in your data, in your experiment, in your analyses are pointing you to, so that you're able to argue what your case is.
We have one more question online here. It says, in the Bayesian statistics philosophy, we don't have p-values. That is also criticized. However, some authors advise the use of evidence values, e-values, without the use of alpha. These ideas might be extended to e-values. That's the question.
So if I'm not understanding the question, please have this individual send me email or whatever. What I wouldn't want anyone to think is that that we should do the same thing with in the Bayesian paradigm that we've done in the frequentist paradigm, and that is to set cutoffs. For example, with like Bayes factor, like, okay, if the Bayes factor is bigger than 6.87, bingo. Thresholds are thresholds. We need to understand what our analyses are telling us, what their limitations are, and we need to and again, multiple methods of analyses. We in this recent ASA editorial, or in the American Statistician editorial, we argue to present analyses multiple ways, and most particularly explain what things mean. In fact, specifically, we argue that if you're going to use a p-value in your scientific report, that you ought to be able to say what it tells you. And if you're going to use a Bayes factor, you ought to be able to say what that Bayes factor tells you in the context of your report.
Is there
so the problem is the thresholds?
Could you hear on the question?
Almost, yes.
Yes, the question was if the problem is the threshold. So the problem is not with the p-value itself. It's with threshold that people set up, so that you say that this is just, if it is above, something happens. If it is below, something else happens.
So yeah, I would say that there's no need for thresholds. Talk about your p-values. Talk about whatever measures you're using, say what they tell you, report all your data, report your effect size, and then talk about what it all means.
Is there any more question? I have a question myself to close. Well, this is indeed a very important issue, and but you know that everyone is doing that. Everyone is looking at the p-values and do above 0.05, below 0.05. And this is not just the authors; it's also the reviewers and the editors of journals all over. How long do you think it will take to change that state of mind?
It will take however long it takes for people to decide that they're going to change their minds. Once people decide that they have to change their minds, it might not take very long to do it. I'll just give this very personal example. I'm working on losing weight. It took me a long time to decide that I needed to lose weight. Once I decided I needed to lose weight, I think I can lose it, in 6 months to a year. But it took me a long time to decide that I needed to.
Right. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, Ron, it was a great pleasure as always, and thank you for sharing your time with us and your excellent presentation.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's good to see you again, friend. Take care.
Bye bye. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.